Easy one. There's a question here about what are other quick ways to access queer theology knowledge other than adding a few more books on the pile, which we all have. So the first one says about talking to people, queer LGBTI people. Absolutely, I think good faith is measured by and demonstrated in relationship. So I think there's no doubt that I was really nervous coming tonight. I never know if things are going to be safe spaces or they're just going to descend into debates that can almost never be helpful on the way that they're engaged. And so that doesn't mean if you're here tonight thinking, I don't know about a lot of this, or there's all sorts of internal disagreement in queer theory, and there's all sorts of internal disagreement in Christianity, and it's absolutely an invitation to be curious and with good faith, but also to have your own thoughts and engage that. But I think good faith is always measured by and demonstrated in human relationships. And I honestly don't think you have a right to debate another person's existence if you're not in relationship with any of them. So absolutely get to know some people and be curious about people who you don't understand without needing to understand them at the end of that. And I think that's just good neighbourly advice, isn't it, for anyone that lives in your street. The other option was, it says website and films. So here in Australia there is a Christian group called Equal Voices, which is a queer Christian group that's trying to engage Christian churches and different Christian institutions. So that could be a group to connect with. I know that they're running some courses and doing some events. There's also a Queer Theology Network, www.queertheologynetwork, which is a website. There are places that have centres for queer theology. So if you Google that, you could definitely find it. And YouTube, yes, there's so many YouTube videos and films. What are people's favourite queer films, if anyone has one? Priscilla Queen. My daughter asked to watch this week, and I was so excited. And so, absolutely, Priscilla Queen of the Desert is an absolute banger. And winner does. So the 1946. I'm going to put a vote in for Top Gun, absolute queer movie. It's my favourite. So some of them you may not know they're queer movies yet, but go back and so. Birdcage, Nathan Lane. And before Nathan Lane even came out. So, there's these interesting dynamics of a time. We've lived through a time that, the glad Hollywood actors community has significantly shifted in our time. So, yes, please add your recommendations as you continue to discuss. That was the easy question. They're all much harder. Okay. How would churches be more welcome? I mean, this is an absolutely vexed and difficult question, and I don't have a great answer to this question because I'm full of doubt and ambivalence about the question. So I'll just let me say that and be honest with that. One thing I will say is 95, in my experience, and I'm really happy for other people here to share, in my experience, 95 to maybe 99% of churches that say they are welcoming and inclusive, even on those very terms, aren't. So be very clear about this. If queer people can't be involved in the worship team at your church or whatever, don't say you're inclusive. Just be honest about who you are so people can make informed decisions about what that means. So I think it's never welcoming to misrepresent what your space is, and being honest is a part of that. But I also think there's all these questions about where power resides and where authority resides in the church. And I think that needs to be significantly interrupted for churches really to be welcoming and inclusive spaces. So that means all the people in power are probably going to have to give up some power, or all of the power, and shift a lot of. And so I think it's whatever I don't have a good answer, but whatever the answer is, it's 10 times more radical than that, I think. And I say that. So I'm a member of the Uniting Church. I've been in placements in the Uniting Church for the last 15 years, and I still yay, but there's such a small number of Uniting Churches that are actually safe spaces. And so I still tell a lot of queer people, don't turn up at a uniting church without because they're so often not safe spaces and will be the site of trauma. And I think we need to take that seriously. We're talking about people, we're talking about each other, and we're talking about people's well-being. So, in places sometimes they might be gay and lesbian affirming, but they're really transphobic. You get behind the veneer and then you discover that. So I think the first thing we need to be as people, if we attend churches, is really, really honest with what the situation is at the churches that we're at, and honest with those who might come and seek a welcoming space. And that would be the beginning of, genuine, meaningful relationships and the kind of change that we might want to see in our churches. But all said with a lot of ambivalence about the possibility. So, all right. Here's a question about that. I think, what is the importance and place of inclusion on the way to the church's transformation through queer theology? It is a really good question, because I do want to say inclusion and representation aren't worth nothing. They can be helpful in strategic ways. And think about women in the boardroom. Did that overcome patriarchy? Like, the conversation in Australia this week has been so ridiculous that we think that if we just have some porn licenses, or what's it called, a porn passport, and kids didn't play video games, we'd overcome the patriarchy, as if it just emerged since video games. Like, we Band-Aid, 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 Band-Aid. So inclusion and representation aren't pointless, but if you think about the girl boss movement, all that's happened in the last 10 years actually is the number of women on boards, which I couldn't give a crap about, has actually gone backwards anyway. So inclusion and representation can be strategic and they can be helpful, but they're not going to overturn the table by themselves, right? So they're something you can use, like identity politics, on the way to another goal. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think, I'm fundamentally talking about political action here. I'm fundamentally talking about social political action, because that's always what queer theory and queer theology has been about, some sort of action and organisation within the community. So I don't want to dismiss them, but I think we need to understand the limits and their strategic usefulness, and know when we've exhausted them, or when that's become our goal. Oh, well, if we just had one of everybody on the church council, then we'd be we've all had that experience. I can't tell you how many times in feminist theologies I've been told, some of my worst bosses were the women. Yeah, I know, because we sit at the table and then we become part of the table. If we don't change the system, that's what happens, right? So we need to understand that, and understand the history and failure of that as a strategy by itself. With the collapse of fixed identities, how can theology of each person in the image of God and Christ died for all be empowerment and not a prison? I actually think I think you're exactly on the right question, because I don't think the idea of being in Christ, I actually think, is entirely resonant with this idea of not having this fixed identity. It's the giving up, and in Philippians 2, we use this language of Jesus, that he emptied himself, the kenosis, and that we're called into, just like that Christ, to empty yourself of those things that create these kind of fixed identities and power positions. And so many of you would be aware of the tradition of reference mystical theology, but also apophatic, or the negative move in theology. It's the way of negation. So it's not what you are, it's what you are not. So God is immutable is a negative statement. We're so impoverished of what we can know about God, all we can actually say what God is not. And so this tradition of apophatic and undoing of identities is at the core of the mystical spiritual life. So if you look at St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, all of the female mystics in the medieval period, it was about the undoing of what you knew about yourself and entering into that mystery in relationship with God. So the identity stops being that thing that you're claiming and resting on and being controlled by, but life in the Spirit and being in Christ. So whoever wrote that question, bang on, yes.
Would you say it's a very sort of scientific view? To say that we can't sort of know God really, it's just our senses of immediate perceptions. It just seems to be a very sort of Lockean view, but back in the 16th century, you had they have a great chain of being,
Yes.
they could know about God. Then Locke, 1680 or 1670 or so, he's saying, we all just keep our knowledge small. We won't seek to reach into the heavens. We will just keep it local and small and seek to address it. So it's a very scientific view, isn't it? Say that we can't really know what's out there. We just sort of have to keep it. It's a form of impressionism, really, isn't it?
Well, I'd say, certainly Immanuel Kant is the guy that says all we can know are things via their appearances of things. And so I'd say it's a more philosophical, humanities version. But I don't think actually, if you look at the kind of scientific events to discern the God particle or da-da-da, I think science actually wants to know, whereas something like negative theology wants to unknow and engage in the opposite kind of project.
But in science, you just kind of have a working model. You don't claim to know what's
No, it's true. That's absolutely true. It's always testing hypotheses and retesting and seeing if absolutely true. But I think the kind of tradition that I'm talking is pre-modernity, the kind of mystical ideas of the medieval period in which, they often talked about the dark night of the soul or the darkening of your knowledge. So it's the undoing of the epistemological frame, quite unlike what emerges in science. But I think they're connected. I can see the connection point. So queer theologians love the mystics. So there's a companion by Gerald Lachlan of a wonderful 25 essays called Queer Theology. It's by Blackwell Publishing, and lots of the essays in there are on the mystics. The mystics are full of sexual energy, so there's a lot of sex and gender stuff happening in there. I'm going to go to a different question. And I think this is a good question. It's about what parts of queer theology are theology and not just queer theory. And I gave you a lot of queer theory tonight, and I admit that. I just didn't want to get into... and this is what queer people do with some parts of the Bible, or this is without unpacking the big conceptual frame, so you can get your head around how it sort of moves against some of the traditions of liberalism and equality. Let me get to the question. So I'm interested in other ways queer theology, not just theory as theology. Yeah, so I don't want to just recommend some books, but there's lots of books in queer theology now that can help you unpack that, and thinking about the queerness of God, or, one of the other questions here is talked about the queer resources already in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, where sexuality and gender don't mean what we decided they've meant in the last few hundred years, right? So we know that. I think, if we don't know that, we can think about for a minute and yes, in different historical periods, sex and gender have meant very different things, and what was acceptable and what was deviant have meant very different things. So there are lots of resources in the Bible for thinking about often people talk about queering, so queering the Bible or queering the Wesleyan tradition or queering as an act of going back to the theological resources and thinking about the Bible. And so, there was another question that I did want to answer. So this is about, about the historical reality in the Roman world, where relationships with adult men and young men was very different to how we would understand that. It was very normative to have first sexual experiences in the Roman world with an older man. And so, but there's no such thing in that world as homosexuality. It's not, sexual identities that we talk about now are a much more recent thing. And it says, when did we begin to turn against the historical identities of queer people in faith? So there's a wonderful Catholic theologian called Mark Jordan, and he's written a book called The Invention of Sodomy, and it's a really wonderful book. That's a provocative title, I know, but that's the one I'd recommend to you. He's a very rich... So he does a lot of systematic theology and Aquinas studies and queer theory. So as only a Catholic could, really, probably. Yeah. I think I've kind of got through. Is there anything I didn't touch that anybody else wants to... Or burning comments, questions? Yes, thank you.
I've read the historical question because I'm a history student. So when I read a lot of the Bible, I try to think of the historical context in which it was written, and I also think about when the Bible came to English translation, it was very much against the time in the Enlightenment period. So I wanted to ask, when was essentially I wanted to, how Nathan pointed out, when was the pivot? When did we start to go, okay, being queer is just wrong. When we know Peter came from a Jewish faith where there's very little knowledge about queer practices in Jewish practice and culture, coming into a Roman world where it's considered the norm, and it wasn't even the word homosexuality, because homosexual is from the 1960s by a German doctor.
Yeah.
Had to come up with an illness, as to put it. So when was the turning point, and how has sexuality in general in the Bible and in Christianity is being pivoted or changed and viewed differently by the cultures of the time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And many of you might know, this might be a way into the question, that the word homosexual cannot appear in the Bible because there was no such word for it and was later added in translations of like Romans 1. So that's often a part of the debate of how can the Bible outlaw something that didn't quite exist in the way it does now. A lot of people, so the history of sexuality by Michel Foucault, it would be the point where people would pivot. The criminalising of homosexuality is the point in which we start thinking about it as a deviancy and a criminal act.
So
Yeah.
didn't Foucault advocate for children to be able to get consent?
Didn't he advocate for children to be able in?
French Parliament.
So in his late, yes, like many friends, absolutely.
Allegations about him in Morocco.
Yes, and there are, absolutely. So that's absolutely questionable, and that's, again, when you're reading French theory, many of them advocate for children to be able to get, it comes up in dozens, if not hundreds, of French philosophers and theories, so it's good to be aware of that. But that would be the kind of historical point that is often understood as the moment that, A, modern sexuality becomes a thing. There's no thing being straight before then. And then suddenly there's a thing being wrong. There's a thing being right. So it's a very recent idea. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Janice, for